Hello, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to the third seminar series on decolonizing forced migration. My name is Hiab Johannes, a postgraduate researcher at the University of Glasgow, and I'm one of the co-organizers of these seminars. We will hear from our distinguished speakers. Today's seminar hopes to unsettle the dominance of Eurocentric ecologies of knowledge production and consumption, and present to us other ways of knowing, organizing ourselves, and understanding cultures and humanity. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to have two of the most distinguished scholars in the field of Afrocentricity to unpack these questions of knowledge production, consumption, and representation for us. Professor Asante and Dr. Dove, thank you so much for giving us your time and agreeing to share your expertise with us. Now, before I invite Khaira to introduce our distinguished speakers, I would like to give you brief information about the proceedings. First, just to remind everyone, this seminar is being recorded, and if you do not want it to be recorded, please switch off your cameras and rename yourselves. And second, we will start with Professor Asante's presentation on Afrocentricism as a new episteme, and Professor Asante's presentation will be followed by Dr. Dove's presentation on the significance of cultures to life and human development. We will have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers, and you can put your questions in the chat box or raise your hand and ask your questions directly. So without further ado, I now invite Khaira to briefly introduce our distinguished speakers. Khaira.
Thank you, Hiab. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on this special seminar with the two distinguished speakers. The first speaker is one of the most influential thinkers in the African world, Mofi Kiti Asante. He's a professor and chair at the Department of Africology at Temple University in Philadelphia. He is the co-founder of the theory of Afrocentricity. He is the president of Mofi Kiti Asante Institute for Afrocentric Studies. He is also the founding and the current editor of the Journal of Black Studies. Asante has a great record of publications with 92 books. Among the most recent one, Radical Insurgeries, The History of Africa, The African American People, A Global History, Erasing Racism, The Survival of the American Nation, Revolutionary Pedagogy, African American History, A Journey of Liberation, African Pyramids of Knowledge, Facing South to Africa. Asante has numerous publications, more than 500 articles, and he is considered one of the most quoted living African authors. It's a great honor to have you with us, Asante, today. And our second speaker is Dr. Dove, a mother and a grandmother, assistant professor at the Department of Africology, at Temple University. She is a transatlantic womanist and Afrocentric theorist of Ghanaian and English heritage. Nadov has written numerous publications, articles, book chapters, and her recent work is Afrocentric Blueprint that provides a foundation for the development of Afrocentric schools and curriculum. She is also an author of African Mothers, Bearers of Culture, Makers of Social Change. She will speak to us today about the significance of culture to life and human development. It's a great honor to have you with us, Dr. Dove. And now, without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Asante to speak to us about Afrocentricism as a new episteme. The floor is yours, Asante.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. This is my first time speaking on a program from Scotland, and I'm delighted that the University of Glasgow students and faculty and hosts, all the co-hosts, have invited me to be a part of this program. I just want to also acknowledge that in Scotland, One of my colleagues, Tommy Curry, is at the University of Edinburgh, one of the first African Americans to be a professor at that university. And I'm just letting you know that he is a major theorist, and really delighted that he's there in Scotland. I also want to just say how much I appreciate Dr. Dove for being a co-participant, because she is, of course, one of our leading thinkers on these issues of Afrocentricity. I'm dedicating my presentation actually today to two people. Actually, one of them is George Floyd, and George Floyd, of course, has changed a lot of things in this country. And I'm also dedicating it to Sheku Bayo in Scotland, two black men dying at the hands of police on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. I've always helped to promote Afrocentricity because I believe it is essential to a corrective history of the world. It is in itself a paradigm, but a paradigm is not enough. We must jump toward a new episteme, one that diminishes the use of race and racism and establishes a human face. This has really been the African quest since the problems we inherited with the West's ideas of dominance. When we argued for the education of African children, for equal opportunities, to have equal outcomes, for social justice and economic justice, we were not merely talking trash. We were talking a response to humanity. We sought to overcome the episteme that saw us as less than human, and then, as often now, lesser humans. Black Lives Matter is just the latest attempt on the part of the powerful driving ethos in the African world to change the nature of the episteme. The word episteme in English is derived, we know, from the Greek word episteme, science or knowledge. The French use it, episteme, as a philosophical term that refers to a principle system of understanding, scientific knowledge, so to speak. The word epistemology is a study of the system of knowledge that is the reigning umbrella for the search for knowledge within a society. For example, I always say the epistemology of a communist society would have a communist way to search for knowledge. A capitalist or an individualist society would have a system of education that responds to that episteme. So in the American Southwest, we have a group that some people refer to as Navajo, but they call themselves Dene. Their children believe in cooperation, not in competition. So if they're sitting in a classroom and there's a child who does not know an answer to a question on a test, you can expect that their peers would tell them the answer, would give them the correct response. And many times this causes problems when you have an episteme that believes in competition. The Navajo or Dene people ask, what's wrong with cooperation? When a person doesn't know, why shouldn't you tell that person? So it's ways of looking, but not just ways of looking. It is also the platform upon which we create theories and paradigms. During the time of African Americans or African people, this is even before we were Americans, because we didn't become Americans until 1865, but we were in the United States or in 1619. But during our time in the American society, we found ourselves operating in the episteme, the Western or European episteme, that defines the possibilities for knowledge and what is accepted as real. What are the types of theories and practices that are considered authentic and useful? We have responded with intense debates, discourses, marches, demonstrations, and essays in support or in opposition as vigorously as a mother would in trying to keep her child from following a false path. Our inclination to demonstrate our capabilities is in whatever context is thrown in our path is a part of the African ethos in the Americas. So of course, yes, I had to read Homer, and I did. I know divine muse speak to me of the riotous wrath of Achilles, Peleus' son, of how he caused 10,000 Greeks to lose their souls and their bodies to be eaten by the birds and the dogs. I mean, that's a part of what we learn in this episteme. You see what I'm saying? We read Shakespeare. We know that, and we studied French and Greek and Latin and German. So those bona fides are there, and they show our ability to overcome obstacles set before us. But what we really are trying to say is that this is certainly a very particularistic notion, very particular and very specific, and it represents one perspective on the world. We're not merely appendages of Europe. We're not just on the margins of Europe. If we are appendages of anything, I always tell people that I'm an appendage of a noble people who existed before the enslavement and the colonization, and who have arrived with a will that has never died, and to demonstrate always excellence, intentionality, and humanity. If you say, for example, in this Western episteme, that the problem is with our speech, or because we have learned this, or we took Yoruba, and or we learned Zulu, or Kikuyu, or Ebonics, or we show you that we can master several languages. And not only can we master several languages, we also know and can master English. But even then, we know that this is not enough for the racist who seeks the obliteration of Africa and the obliteration of Africans. The critical race theorists, who are very much ascendant in the U.S. In many respects, much like the decolonialists, have announced a vigorous campaign for critical race theory, but it still operates within the white supremacist episteme. It's just like I always say, the decolonialists do the same thing. They still operate within the episteme, where colonialism is the defining mark. So you either talk against it, or you try to reform it, or you try to deal with it. Afrocentrists have basically abandoned all attempts like that. But these critical race theory people want to transform racism, to make race relations better, and to create critical margins for determining the future of race and racism. There are some useful things here, but this is not enough. Let me use the language of a brilliant philosopher, probably whom you have never heard of, but you should have. But because of the Western episteme, you have not, probably. His name is Chinweizu. He wrote a book many years ago called The West and the Rest of Us. And he calls the system of knowledge characterized by where we are and what we are dealing with, whether we're at the University of California, or at Harvard, or Yale, or at Oxford, or Manchester, or Leeds, or Glasgow, or Edinburgh. What we are dealing with is a pan-European academy. Now, the Pan-European Academy is formed by the Western or European episteme, almost with no regard, or very little regard, to other perspectives or other ideas. And this is why Afrocentricity has often gotten a very negative reputation in the intellectual world in the West. It's simply because we say you can't have the whole table. The table has to be shared. In fact, there's no particular culture or particular frame that can claim itself as universal. That's not where we're going. So we say this Pan-European Academy is formed by this episteme that has established all of the objectives, all of the goals and conditions for acceptable knowledge in the West. Of course, we have achieved despite that academy. And that is what we have done. And in fact, many of us have even mastered that academy. But again, you can write about race in ways that provide the Pan-European Academy with the legitimacy to say that it has heard you and has heard your position. I mean, you can have seminars, you can have conferences, and so on. But the episteme continues. You can certainly write about education in ways that affirm the Pan-European Academy, and you can be praised for it to the extent that African people are willing to disengage from their own history, from their own cultures, from their own traditions, from their own languages, from their own values. They will be more likely to be accepted as part of the Pan-European Academy. We have all in our careers been looking for hiding places. I should speak for myself. Let me talk for myself. It took me a long time to wrestle myself from the University of California clinches that imprisoned me. I was a student at the University of California, Los Angeles, and it's taken me 40 years to sort of take those clinches off of my brain and off of my mind. Carter G. Woodson, very outstanding major African-American historian, wrote in 1933 a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And at that time, he did not have the language of episteme, but he knew something was wrong. He asked questions that I'm asking. Why is it that we do not know the name of Imhotep, the builder of the first pyramid in the world? Well, why is it that school children throughout the world have never heard of this black man who built the first pyramid, which is the very beginning of the collection of human knowledge? This is where we learn about astronomy. It is where we learn about anatomy. It is where we learn about geometry and mathematics. Why do we go to Homer instead of Imhotep? Who brought that upon us so that we are misdirected? So we become, in a sense, trapped by Homer, who lived, nearly 1,500 years after Imhotep. Why are Sheshat and Jehudi not seen in the light of their introduction of writing, according to the ancients? Who has forgotten Aksum or the majestic work of the Nubians at Jebel Barkal? The Pan-European Academy is not any physical school in Asia or North America or Europe or Africa or South America. It's not physical in that sense. It is a combination of all of these schools that have been created because of white racial domination, whether through colonization, enslavement, apartheid, or the insistence that people abandon their cultures, which of course to the Pan-European Academy are second rate anyway. I should point out that the Pan-Arab Academy also exists, though it is not so dominant as a Pan-European Academy. There is no Pan-African Academy. This may be an advantage, since I'm going to make a suggestion at the end of the speech which will leapfrog these specific academies. Let me describe in general what I mean by the Pan-European Academy. It has a superstructure that is comprised of all of the Nobel laureates, the collective boards of all professional organizations, the combined professorates of all universities, the honorary doctorates and awardees of esteem. Don't be afraid. I'm also somewhere in that list. It sets the standards, however, for what passes as education in general, and in particular in the West. All references to European ancestors, with the exception of those who violate the episteme by trying to become more fully human in their outlook, are counted as establishing the code of conduct and the model for emulation. The Pan-European Academy dictates the books that are considered the canon for particular subject fields, books that are necessary for that Pan-European Academy worldwide to exist, and the types of references accepted by journals that maintain the standards of testimony, the people that you must cite as ancestors or giants in the educational field. This is a regulatory action. We see regulatory actions that authenticate what must be done to maintain the Pan-European Academy. It is an episteme. Inside it, you find many theories and paradigms, all conforming to the episteme. There is a philosophical line, a critical theorist line, and an educationalist line. If you were to bring into the philosophical line people like Merikari, Dwaf, Ptahhotep, Amenemhat, Akhenaten even, this would be considered heresy because they're not in the philosophical line of the Western episteme. And people would say, oh, why is it? Or even Plotinus. They would even take Plotinus, the African, and claim that well, we can maybe accept him on the margins as a Neoplatonist. But the point of the matter is that this Western episteme, like all so-called pan-European, pan-Arab type of ideas, basically are closed systems. The episteme is always the contraption that makes it possible for you to travel to your destination. It's not necessarily the destination itself, but the apparatus to help us determine not what is true or false, but how do you characterize the approach to truth or falsehood. In effect, a society functions with an operational system, so to speak, that contains all of the equipment necessary for creating knowledge. Therefore, when we say that something is a paradigm, we're speaking about something that exists within an episteme. Indeed, without an episteme, there could be no particular paradigmatic action. All paradigms are derived from what constitutes the overarching episteme. One does not consciously create an episteme. When we are born into it. You come out of the womb and look, there it is. Getting out of it is the most important thing we can do with our lives, especially if we feel it is oppressive. It is true of history that dangerous ideas creep into crevices and must be thoroughly acknowledged before we can clear them out. We know that paradigm is an all-encompassing collection of beliefs and assumptions that result in the organization of scientific practices. We have often spoken in Afrocentricity about the Afrocentric paradigm, and there are articles and books written about that paradigm. But the term episteme is not restricted to use in scientific constructions of knowledge. It is a larger, more expansive idea of what defines everything in a society: art, education, science, astronomy, philosophy, mathematics, and even religion. It is not merely the columns that uphold the temple of a society, but the episteme is what constitutes the reason for the columns in the first place. Let me say a few more words about the Western European episteme to explain how it relates to Africans in a society like the United States, a society based on white supremacy. Let us use our talents to sort of expose structural failures in a multicultural society, because the United States is, of course, a very multicultural society and is increasingly becoming multicultural very rapidly. So much so that in the major public schools in the major urban cities, they're almost all dominated by people who are not white. Better yet, how African people have dealt with our experiences with this structure for over 400 years is part of our history. It is here that we see the insistence for a new way of looking at reality and actually suggesting a different episteme. Africans were brought to the Americas en masse between 15th and 19th centuries from the continent of Africa and enslaved in the United States. No slaves were brought. There are no such thing as African slaves. The African people were brought, and African people who came from all positions of life, whether they were farmers or musicians or fisher people or whether they were artisans, or African people were brought and then enslaved in Mexico, in the United States, in Brazil, in the Bolivarian states that became Venezuela and Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, several other political states, taken from Africa, where the cultural, natural, and spiritual and social configuration of societies were different. So we, that is our ancestors, found themselves in a society whose episteme had been rooted in a very different reality. And I think it's very important to understand that at the time, there were several fundamental assumptions, invisible mythical attitudes, and collective understandings that clearly promoted the notion of European superiority. And whether you take that as, the examples where you had the Greek background, for example, where you would have schools named after certain Greek people, or you would have everything basically dominated by Europe. Even in Africa, sometimes we see the city names, street names, even the planets, the weekdays, the stars, even corporations are characteristically given Western names. And it's amazing to go through certain cities in Africa and say, wow, where all these European names came from? Well, of course they came from the notion of white European superiority, and they came from the colonization, or the way that the forcing of Africans to abandon their own episteme. They're often racist in identification, because if you have political and economic power, you are able to force your ideas on all others without even ever asking, is this correct? But the inquisitive scholar, the inquisitive person, the intellectual wants to expose the way the myths constrain education, work, communications across fields in medicine and so forth, and astronomy. As African intellectuals, to implement to create a different world, one where you have not a pan-European academy or a pan-African academy or a pan-Arab academy, but a pan-world academy, would take an Afrocentric understanding. Here's what I mean by Afrocentricity and an Afrocentric understanding. Afrocentricity is the idea that the African narrative must always hold when we start with chronology, that the beginning of chronology is Africa. All human beings are derived ultimately from Africa. That's the place. There's only one race. It's a human race. And that human race starts on the continent of Africa. It doesn't start on any other continent. There's no polygenesis. There's only monogenesis. One place where the beginning happens, and it happens in Africa. Not only is it monogenesis, but the first civilization. Not just Homo sapiens, but the first people to decide what was edible and what was not. How do you cross a stream or river? How do you protect yourself from animals? They had to be Africans, because until 70,000 years ago, everybody in the world was black. There was no other people. People hadn't migrated from Africa then. And Homo sapiens came into being about 300,000 years ago. And most of that time, up until 70,000 years ago, most of that time was spent in Africa. So when we see common nicknames for sport teams, like Athenians and Trojans and Titans and Phoenix and all these, we understand that this is an epistemic thing. There are other names that could have been chosen. I mean, we don't have to choose Cronus or Eros or Fortuna or Hypno or Mars or Mercury or Narcissus or Calypso. But do we know or have we heard of Oduduwa? Have we heard of Shamanuka, Obatala, Oshun, Oya, Eshu, Adwana, Agona, Asikiri, Asini, Asona, Bretuo, Ekuona, and Oyoko? I ask these questions because why not? When we are sown into the belly of the world that is constituted by people moving all across the world, and the First Nations, the native people. I mean, what about their ancestors? What about the ancestors of the Australian people and the North American and South American people who were killed by the Europeans when they went into Argentina and Chile and used the people sort of as sports on Sundays to ride their horses and shoot all of the native people that they saw. So this is important because a fruitful unveiling of all mythic realities, even at the crossover level, will help us understand the difficulties and joys of sharing social and intellectual space. It is necessary for one to know, of course, in order to make use of these mythic realities. And that's why I tell people I honor teachers, because respect is a central lesson of teaching. And to be a good teacher, you have to be a good person. To be a good person, you can't be a white racist. So when we talk about what happened in the world and how we come to the place where we have come to, then we understand that it is extremely significant for us as human beings living today to examine how the memes of Greek and Roman realities are related to those other classical civilizations in the world, because this will help us to minimize the aggressive anti-human behavior of those who do not understand the totality of human experience. I'm suggesting that it is necessary to be conscious of Zeus while simultaneously discovering in the Greek symbol the psycho-myths that haunt our present time. I do not project either Ra or Ptah or Amen or Oduduwa as superior to Zeus, only that they have a seat at the table. Our own African system has been badly broken, and we are victims of underdeveloped or unexposed knowledge about our own cultural histories, and that's because we were forced to abandon many of them. I mean, many times school children on the African continent could not speak their own language. If you were heard speaking, my ancestors are from Sudan and from Nigeria. If you were heard speaking Nubian, you would be beaten in school. If you were heard speaking Yoruba in school, you would be beaten, whether by the Arabs in Sudan or by the British in Nigeria. It's the same. This leads to an entrenched position that often seems impregnable. You say, wow, they must be universal. No, they're not universal. The best way to recognize and memorialize the Western episteme is through looking at the Greek mythologies. But you have to look at the Holy Bible, look at the Shakespeare, all of these. These are merely the intellectual or literary basis of the episteme. They're not the invisible, perhaps genealogically shaped responses to environment, to people, and the supernatural. What we can discover in the literary works is what Europeans see as significant, and this seeing also comes from somewhere before we get to the literary. So I'm going to try to bring this to close by, I mean, there's much more I could say about that, certainly about the religion of the Europeans prior to Christianity coming in Europe. There's still evidences of the Roma Va and other traditions, Druidism in Europe, but we won't talk about that. I just want to finish up by saying that that we need to search for a pan-world academy where the contributions, achievements, and governance, that is the maintenance of the system, is multicultural, pluralistic, and constructive, and takes into consideration all human beings. That is the Afrocentric way. And Ana Montero Ferreira, in her book, The Demise of the Inhuman, where she talks about Afrocentricity, modernism, and postmodernism, she makes this case that Afrocentricity presents to the world the first basis for trying to understand a collective sense of humanity. There will be those who will say that it cannot be done. But as we have learned in Africology, which is the Afrocentric study of African phenomena, and at Temple University, and as we have shown, you can integrate these ideas in viable ways, different perspectives, if you give them equal time. You cannot take all the food on the table and then tell others they must eat what is left. Sharing is a key to this, and it's a key to an African concept. And it is where African people have gotten this concept of the world and sense of humanity. The Pan-World Academy is fluid. It should be fluid, and that's its power. It will knock the specific academies off of their feet and be driven by the excitement of young Africans around the world who are Congolese, Ghanaian, Eritrean, Ethiopian, Cuban, Brazilian, Haitian. They live in Brooklyn, in Houston, Atlanta, Johannesburg, Kinshasa. There's a whole new world coming, and it's a pan-world. It's not a pan-African only. It's a pan-world concept. And for an academy, you see, you must come to the knowledge by your own reflections. After much reading, I've only pointed to a direction. The uncomfortable initiative is the one that establishes new paths. Otherwise, you are running in someone else's tracks. Sylvia Winter says, maybe we should say not education that we're looking for, but we are looking for initiation. And if we could understand that, I think that we will come very close to what we are trying to do about this assertion of an Afrocentric way of thinking that will help us revivify and create the ascending house of humanity. I want to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for this inspirational and thought-provoking presentation, Professor Asante. I will now invite Dr. Dove to present her presentation as well before we go to question and answers.
Oh, okay, thank you. I thought we would have the questions next, but anyway, thank you so much for the honor of being here. And thank you, Dr. Asante, who is a mentor and the director of the department that I'm honored to work in. It's the one place in the world where we can discuss things pertaining to Africa from a perspective that loves African humanity. And as a result of having these kinds of discussions, we can free our minds from the Pan-European Academy and episteme that has been clouding our thoughts on who we actually are. And as an Africologist, it has become so apparent that the other departments and the other disciplines that endorse this, the Pan-European or the Pan-Arab Academy, are grounded in constructs that have racialized humanity and theories that arise from that, which debase African humanity, every single one, whether it's sociology, biology, psychology, anthropology, they're all guilty of this. And I want to go to my PowerPoint to try to explain how that is the case. And Dr. Asante, you've done a wonderful job of doing the explanation already, but you know, I hope I show with my PowerPoint some of the details about what culture is to humanity, how important it is to living, breathing, enabling us to survive. So I will share my screen and try to get straight to the first one. The significance of culture. Okay, I think it's this one that goes here. And I'm taking a Jopian perspective, Sheikh Anta Diop, who is a person who has contributed greatly, immeasurably to the Afrocentric episteme. So I'm looking at culture. I want to sort of look at culture. I won't take long going through this, but the significance of culture from a Diopian perspective. You see, culture, concept of culture comes out of essentially out of anthropology. But what Diop did was to take culture from an anthropological perspective, but he rather changed the direction of thinking, because anthropology uses culture in a way to racialize humanity and justify the demonization and debasement of African humanity, and the blacker the person, the more debased and dehumanized. But anyway, so we're looking at an essentially anthropological idea of culture, but we're taking it out of its context. So it's a human endeavor which all humans develop and must have. It's like breathing, you can't live without it. It's a powerful purveyor of ideas, values, beliefs, aids in shaping of human thoughts. It's historical, it can't exist without that. As long as we've been here, this is what we've been doing. Although there are some who try to say that there are people without culture, that's impossible. As long as you're human, you have culture. And it binds people in ways that they choose. What's very important about culture, which is often missed when we're looking at institutional development, we often look at institutional development as if it is just socially developed, and in a sense it is, but culture is what defines social development, so we can't miss that out. And what it does is help you recognize the shaping and the forming of these institutions in relations to the cultures that they arise from. So when we just talk about politics, we often think, oh, politics, it's just open, it's a social thing. All people have politics, or only some people have politics, but it's really shaped and structured by culture. So from relationships, family, healthcare, education, politics, economics, even entertainment, the arts and spiritual systems. These are just some of the things, but they are strictly related to whichever cultural group formed them. So they're formed in the interests of surviving through those institutions. All cultural groups invest in the development of their people so that members may flourish and survive. That's, of course, absolutely basic. Why else would you have a culture? It molds the mind and intellect. Now, this is very, very important because, as Dr. Asante was referring to the episteme, so we know that the mind is actually central, and how that mind works, central to the shaping of cultures. So the method of how mind and intellect evolve is vital to cultural identity. You know, from the culture that helps to develop humans, there's an identity related to that culture, which is the primary identity that any people can have in relation to their existence, their cultural identity. As Dr. Diop said, there are 4 factors. They're like the pillars of culture, that history, language, psychology, and spirituality are absolutely key elements, pillars of culture. So now I've borrowed, because of my interest in women, I've written about mothers mainly, but I have a great interest in women and raising the presence of women in all kinds of materials that have denied their existence, particularly African women. So I say his and her historical factor to just bring the fact that women are a part of the story of humanity, and without women, you wouldn't be able to have humanity. In cultural identity itself, it provides a consciousness that enables people to identify themselves as part of a population connected in ways that define their traditional similarities and distinctions from other people. We're not all the same. And in fact, the idea of culture is to show that culture, in fact, determines people's behaviors, thoughts, actions, how they live, how they die, how they decide what's going to happen in their lives. And that is the biggest distinguishing feature of humanity's differences. This is, you know, as an Afrocologist, what we understand through the Afrocentric analysis of humanity. So it's not, well, we will see. It's a valuable, cohesive base language, because it transmits ideals, hopes, aspirations, directives, values, and beliefs. And it conveys spoken musical expressions that can evoke all manner of emotional states, movements, and healing. This is what you can do with language, the way you speak. From the ancient African idea of language is what you convey to others, you transmit to others. So the sounds that you give are either harmonizing or destroying your environment. So language is absolutely very, very vital. Psychology, we includes the idea of psyche, because that's where psychology, the term, comes from, but we also root it in the ancient African words called saku, the soul of being, because unlike the discipline of psychology, which is very much formulated around the idea that there is the mind, but not the spirit. And the original idea of psychology is that the spirit is the spirit. You know, that's the African Kemetic belief. But what we're studying is within a European episteme, which tends to marginalize spirituality and things other than what can actually be seen. So it helps find our location and gives us knowledge of our society. It's coming from our mind and behavior. It contributes to personal and societal development and therefore potential futures. Cultural groups create spiritual systems that reflect their values and beliefs. There's a recognition of a higher order of power that can be tapped into using certain rituals. All cultures believe in something greater than themselves. This power is given names to identify historical uses and accomplishments. So a cultural group, this is absolutely key, must love its own humanity. And if the culture that you live in despises your humanity, then it's not your culture. You have not developed this. You may have been part of the development of the culture, depending on your status within that culture. If you're captured in that culture and debased in that culture, then you know that is not your culture, because your culture would love your humanity and uplift your being and your soul and whoever you are, if that was your culture. So you can tell, you know. That is my first one. I will hope you will bear with me. And I will go to the second one, which explains the episteme more clearly. That's just to give you a background on the importance of culture to humanity, because it is through culture that we define what humanity actually is. So let me try to share again. Maybe I didn't need to come out, I don't know. I know I have to make the screen smaller. So, oh, there it is. Okay. Gosh, I'm so sorry. So, can you see that?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. I should get out of it and start again. I'm so sorry. I'm so bad with technology. I usually get there in the end. So I have to share again, get to the PowerPoint and episteme.
Yeah.
That's it, yeah.
Coming now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And as Dr. Asante had pointed out, this is, you know, I think that it's probably going to be controversial. So please bear with me as I try to explain. All right, then. And then I have to do this. Okay. So as Dr. Asante pointed out throughout the whole talk, what episteme is, points that I'd like to make is it's that episteme and epistemology, the study of knowledge, and episteme being knowledge, and they are shaped by culture. They are shaped by culture, and they cannot exist without each other. They're not separate from each other. And I borrow the word ma'at because it means truth in the ancient African way. And it also means order. And truth should underpin episteme and the source of knowledge and the study of knowledge, so that we understand how we exist. But when we talk about logic, we cannot actually logic cannot exist without truth. So even a baby can understand logic if truth is being spoken. Because when you speak, if your words are harmonizing, then they're grounded in truth. So logic and truth cannot exist without each other. So a lot of mad people ruling the world right now, talking about things that are not logical, but believing that they are, because they don't understand that truth is the basis of that. So it plays a vital role in what is believed about the past and their four possible futures. Those who produce what we call knowledge control what we consider to be truth. I'm not sure how to get to the next one.
You can use the arrows on the left and the left one.
Yeah, keyboard, yeah.
Yeah, I'm using those, but there must be something else I can use. I'm not sure how. Oh, you mean this one here? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm using my keyboard. Sorry. Okay, so European epistemology or episteme we're going to look at. This is the knowledge, the idea. This is what the episteme is grounded in, the idea that we go through stages of human development towards civilization. And these are just some of the things that we believe, that we're taught in every discipline. Hunter-gatherers, lower stage, spirituality and ancestral respect, lower stage, because of ancestors being involved. Matriarchy, lower stage. Enslavement, lower stage, although we're still practicing it today. Monotheistic religiosity, a higher stage. Urbanity, a higher stage, and materiality and profit, a higher stage. These are the things that we place on pedestal and the other things that we place below, because it's kind of a stage theory idea, this episteme that we're all living in, which is the foundation of the Pan-European Academy. Okay, so try to divide it into falsehood and truth. In these epistemes. So force, using the word, creates chaos, and isfet is a term used in the ancient African tradition, which what we're asked to believe is that less melanated people are more advanced. This is a race construct, and in reality, humans can't live without melanin. It exists in the brain, all vital organs. It's a vibrational feature, and it awakens the mind and consciousness, and exists in the atmosphere and stores and conducts light within the body, which exists as energy. So melanin is highly important, but in this episteme, the less melanin you have, the more superior you are, and the more melanin you have, the more inferior you are in the construct of race, which is a hierarchy of humanity where the lightest people are at the top and the darkest people at the bottom. This is the episteme that we're dealing with. So I've looked at these two situations here. Race identity, as Dr. Asante mentioned before, we've got critical race theory, which is within the race paradigm itself. Through Afrocology, we're stepping out of the race paradigm and we're looking at human beings, and we're looking at culture as the greatest determinant that will show differences among humans, whereas in the European episteme, we're looking at genetic differences among human beings, and we're basing that on melanin content. So race identity is actually not a real identity. There's just one human race, as Dr. Asante said, and we are all that race, whether we have a lot of melanin or we don't have a lot of melanin, but it is our culture that defines our differences. And within that culture, the episteme will be the food of knowledge, which gives us these ideas and assertions about who we are. And when we're grounded in the race theory and believing that the blackest people are the most inferior and the lightest are the most superior, then we're mentally ill. But we don't know this because it appears to be a truth and reality, because that's what we're taught when we go to schools that do not shower any knowledge about human reality, but construct an idea in the inferiority of African women and men and children. And it's designed to justify the enslavement and colonization of our latest African people who are still on the continent, and those of us who have migrated to different parts of the world. So it maintains a false social order which we can live and die by. Based on the fact that I'm a light-skinned person, I more easily can walk down a street in America or the UK or wherever and live compared to a black woman, a very dark-skinned black woman and dark-skinned black man. I have more chance of life. So it isn't even something casual. It is about life and death, and that is the core of the pan-European episteme. And what it does is stultify the development of all people within that construct, because we all have expectations as to who we are, what we can achieve, and so on. And that puts us into a construct right there where our potential has already been decided through this race paradigm that we live by, which is the major episteme, yes. Now, the patriarchy is very important here, because patriarchy, from the Diopian perspective, because I've always been interested in women's power, is part of this culture. Patriarchy has essentially created the notion of race, because patriarchy, the domination of the man over the woman, is foundational to developing ways of thinking and being, and superiority and greed and avarice and lies and domination and aggression to maintain that power. That is actually the basis of the construction of race. That I would have to go back to, should have begun with this, but the Diopian idea is that there are only two cultures in the world, because every culture must exist with a woman and a man to reproduce that culture and reproduce children and the future generations. So it's either the woman and the man are together in a reciprocal relationship, which in fact is African, and all people left Africa in that reciprocal relationship to develop their futures, their children, their generations, and their cultural beliefs. And based on male-female reciprocity, out of that is the foundation for democracy, for truth, for justice, all those type of things. But if the other culture is the domination of the female by the male, and out of that you get injustice, isfet, aggression, control, domination, lies, hypocrisy, because the domination of one over the other is the first actual injustice and the first hierarchy, which spreads into all the institutions we talked about when we were looking at culture. So from relationships to family to economics, to healthcare, to politics, to education. They're all founded on that inequality and that injustice. Am I? I'm probably at the end. I can't tell, but I'll get through this quickly. So I've looked at this construction of race, which predominates, which is predated, like we can put it to the 1400s when Europeans were doing that to African people, but prior to that, it had already been done to African people. And so we can go back 2,000 to 3,000 years, maybe even more, we're not sure, to the scriptures and traditions of Hebraic, Brahmins, Hindus with Indo-Aryans, Christians with Europeans, and Muslims with this belief in the hierarchy of, the lighter skin at the top and the blackest person who is either has been punished and committed a sin to justify enslavement and conquest, or to use pseudoscientific methods of it is a genetic thing. So that's why black people need to be punished, the darker skinned people at the bottom. So out of male domination over the female, all these injustices have happened in our minds and have been accepted as if this is a norm. And the thing is that we know that before race, that not all cultures are racist. Before the construction of race, the idea was not about race, it was about humanity. And even though that's in the past, and through pseudosciences, we don't want to look at the past because the past is irrelevant to now, we have to look at the past actually to understand what the future could be, because the past actually holds some traditions and ways of thinking that are far superior to the ways of thinking that we use now to decide who's going to live, who's going to die, who deserves to be punished, who deserves to be lower in the hierarchy, who deserves to be up in the hierarchy, and so on. This is what we're using today. And this episteme is the foundation of all these disciplines that we're studying. The blood of African people has actually made the profit to create these disciplines and give these universities space to define what these disciplines are. And these are all part of the Pan-European Academy and our thinking. Even though it debases us, we're still struggling to hold on to these kind of disciplines, which is why Afroecology is so important, because it's all about humanity. It's not about constructions. We're trying to get away from that. So what happens is that we're always underfunded. We're always shown to be people who don't know what's going on, glorifying and romanticizing African people, when, the very people who are pointing that out have bloodied fingers and have actually profited and been privileged by the debasement of African people. And we're trying to hang on to these theories to think of a better world. How can we think of a better world? That is the problem of people in decoloniality, for instance. That's a really good it tells you that this is wrong. It doesn't tell you where to go, because the thing is that we don't believe in the beauty of Africa and what African people were taken away from, and how African people actually gave us ideas and sciences that today we have struggle understanding. We will even say that it's so great, we admire it, but it came from another planet, or it came from white people or Arabic people. We will never admit that the darkest skinned people ever did any of this. And finally, there's a place before we came out of Africa 70,000 years ago, we'd already created stone. I mean, there's evidence of that in South Africa. Dr. Asante has seen it. In Zala Nyanga, I think, Nlanga, I think is the place, which is over 100,000 years old, you know. So we know we were doing stuff, but we're denied that sort of authenticity to discuss these things. So I think that's everything. This is the final thing. For our liberation, then, this is what we believe as Afrocologists, that the Afrocentric episteme offers the cultural tool to analyze and examine the exact nature of anti-African, anti-women, anti-Black, anti-human, anti-nature cultural processes of colonization. So it opens the minds to the possibilities and potentiality of humanity. So I'll end on that, and thank you very much for listening to me, and hope it made sense.
Thank you, Dr. Dove. I will now invite Professor Allison to reflect on the presentation and how they might be linked to forced migration as well, and then we will go to the question and answer sessions.
Thank you so much, Hiab, and respect to you, and thank you, Dr. Dove and Dr. Asante. It has been really wonderful to use your words, Dr. Asante, to be part of the joy of sharing this social and intellectual space, and to follow the path that you are opening up for us, Dr. Dove, to be able to rest from being forced into the race identity, and to be able to take a path into finding again, discovering again those identities which are of all people, of culture, which belong to all human beings, and in our intimate relationships with the more than human world, to listen and share with you and begin to understand how there might be a recovery from all of our violent epistemologies, and most particularly in forced migration, from the violent epistemologies that are perhaps most fully experienced by those who have been forced to migrate. As you said, Dr. Asante, people were turned into slaves for Americans. There were no African slaves in the sense that you were speaking of. This was something constructed and produced out of epistemologies exported from the European ways of thinking, from particular dominant forms of production of knowledge that were based within class structures and which were around the accumulation, particularly of wealth, and at this shameful period in our history of enslavement, the accumulation of wealth in the form of the ownership of other human beings. And we are only at the very start, as you have both so carefully shown us, of actually recovering from that. And today it is so much about us beginning to find our way again. And as you said, Dr. Asante, this will be an uncomfortable journey because that path has not yet been taken, or when it has been taken, it's grown over with thickets and thorn bushes. It's no longer easy to find that path. One of my favourite books is a wonderful book by a woman called Margaret Elphinston. It's called A Sparrow's Flight, a Novel of a Future. And in it, she really beautifully looks at a future society in the north of England and in the south of Scotland that have learned from a nuclear holocaust, from a time when the land was poisoned and how they might find the land again. And it's a story of people who were forced from the lands, and then in that disaster that was of genocidal proportions to that people in her imaginations, she so shows how gradually, bit by bit, archaeologically a way was found. And so if I may, I'd just like to respond to you in poetry myself, I was really struck by the way that you were speaking of listening to and maybe finding your way from the stars. And I've recently been writing about how we might find our way and how the stars overhead in the north are not the same as when you're in the south, and of the places where you see the Southern Cross and where you don't. Only it isn't the Southern Cross for many. It has different names and different terms. I might look up and see the Pleiades, but my friends who are Maori, they will see Matariki. And they will see the year turning at another time. But I just want to share in the spirit of us finding our way from what has been forced from us, and as acknowledging that all of us at some point in our ancestry will have a time where our cultural identities have been forced from us for reasons of greed and reasons of profit. To share with you my response to Professor Kofi Anidaho, and his work in African humanities, and as the great Ghanaian poet and poet of the Rwandan genocide that he is. And he's written a most beautiful book about finding our way home, and in particular, finding a way for our dreams. And so I hear in both of your talks, yes, indeed, the profound scholarship of people undertaking an archaeology where the traces are those tiny fragments left over to those who have for generations lived with the realities of forced migration, a scrap of cloth, a tiny fragment of a painting on a rock, something left in language which we might be able to begin through careful forensic phonetics to find where that might be from. But also that we have our imaginations. We have dance, we have story, we have what often has lingered long in those oral traditions, precisely because the Eurocentric ways have not honoured those traditions. Not only have they not honoured them, but they have not looked to them, they have not understood them. In my own studies of folklore as a PhD student, I very much came to realise that the work I was doing was very much the work that was marginalised and peripheral to the human sciences, that it wasn't really taken seriously, this work of women's hands, this work of singing to children, this work of helping people learn a mother tongue that truly was a mother tongue and a grandmother tongue. So just in the spirit of this gathering, I want to share these words with you, Dr. Asante and Dr. Dove, that we might all find a way for our dreams. Finding our way into the memories of a place where words were born and born bare against the white skin of the page. Finding our way forwards to words strong enough for this growing child, the hungry one at my breast, drinking me wet and then dry. Finding our way when the way is lost, when wartime means that the way planned and marked on the map is no longer a way. When death is the way and there is no path, and the footsteps tell of the ancestors who tell only of the way they came to bring us to this point, when the way is not the way, and the path is just a wandering across the moorland to the salt marsh we will water with our tears. Today, we thank you. Just enough. That's all. A diet of your words that nourish and nurture the only art that matters, the art of living and loving. Thank you.
That's lovely.
Thank you, Alison.
Very, very beautiful.
Thank you. I think we now proceed to question and answers. And if there are any questions, please, you can chat. You can write them in the chat box, or you can also ask them directly. You can raise your hands.
I want to thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a question from Grace. well, I guess maybe to both speakers, and the question would be was the term Afrocentric episteme not serving the objective it wants to express humanity?
Yeah, I would like to answer that.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It's a very good question. But it's a question that probably is made complicated by terminology itself. And also by the confusion that's already in the literature. The idea behind Afrocentricity is not that it's a counterpart to Eurocentricity. So sometimes people think that, well, Eurocentricity is one thing, Afrocentricity is just the opposite thing. No, it is not that. It is that for us, the Afrocentric episteme is based fundamentally on the idea that there's one humanity. And that humanity is first discovered, derived, originated on the African continent. So the first thing you got to deal with in order to build humanity again is to see Africa for what it was and what it is. That is the origin of humanity, the origin of human civilization. When the African people existed only on the continent of Africa, they recognized that there was difference between human beings. There were some human beings that after a few hundred or 1,000 years would speak different languages. They recognized that some people were short and some people were tall. Some people were thin and some people were not. They recognized that. But what happened was that Africans never ranked human beings on the basis of their anatomy or the texture of their hair. That was not a ranking done by African people. That was something that came after Africans left the continent. So for us, the Afrocentric episteme is, as the Portuguese author Ana Ferreira has said, the Afrocentric episteme is the one that gives humanity the best hope, because then we're talking about what was and this is why Dr. Dove, I think, was very incredible in her presentation by talking about by culture, because what we're talking about is something that gets us back to humanity, and sometimes people could say. Someone could say, well, humanocentric, but if you say humanocentric at this point, then you would have the argument that, well, the Eurocentrics would try to assume that that's what they talk about, but it's a different thing. So Afrocentric is a better term for right now. The Afrocentric episteme is not about particularization. It is not about a specific so-called race, because the only race is human race. And everything starts on the continent of Africa. So the first thing is chronology.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Yeah, if I may ask, then I have a question I would like to ask to both speakers. So my question is on achieving an Afrocentric episteme while using, maybe I come from Eritrea, and what I did my undergraduate studies in English. So the curriculum, the classical theory figures that we did, readings, they were all Western philosophical and historical figures. So I see the university I did my undergraduate, a physically located university. So the language, the materials we used, the literature, they were all Western based on Western philosophical and historical thought processes. So the question is, can we achieve an Afrocentric episteme while we all are using our English? And in the context of Dr. Dove's presentation as well, language not only as a verbal communication tool, but language also as a carrier of identities, ideations, culture. Can we achieve them, or how does this affect the idea of achieving Afrocentric episteme if we are still using the same educational, scholarly, Professor Asante, you mentioned Pan-African Academy, and maybe related to that would be then, how do you see the role of the post-liberation African state in assuming and maybe using the same colonial educational institutions in today's Africa.
Is that specific to me or Dr. Dove or?
Either one of us.
Yeah.
You've written on
Okay.
Pan-Africanism and so on. So.
Okay. So yes. So let me try to say it this way, which will, I think, hopefully be helpful for us to understand that the colonial language that we use, whether it is French or English or German or Spanish, as in the Americas, many black people use Spanish as a colonial language. But the colonial language often conceals the real cultural foundation of the people who are speaking, because sometimes it comes out, and that is when you have the language is changed. That is when that particular language, whether it is English or French or Spanish, takes on a form that the African people use that relates to, as much as they know, sort of an African sensibility. And then we get what we call in the U.S., for example, we get Ebonics. Ebony and phonics is a combination we call Ebonics. We get Ebonics. I grew up speaking Ebonics. That was the language of my mother and my grandmother and so forth. So that is one way to look at it. There's another way to look at it. That is that the language is a tool. It's almost like when people first saw the writing of the African people in Timbuktu. When they saw the writing of the African people in Timbuktu, the first people who saw it thought that it was Arabic. But no, it was not Arabic. It was the language of the Bamana people. But it was written with Arab script. That is just like French and English are both written with a Latin script. We don't say that English is Latin. Or that French is Latin. I mean, certainly French comes from Latin, and certainly there are Latin elements in English. But fundamentally, what the people did with the Latin script was to give it meaning in terms of their own life and their own culture. So I'm not so much worried about African people using any language. What I'm worried about, and more worried about, is whether or not they adopt, say, for example, in your case, I told you earlier that it took me 40 years or so to get UCLA out of my brain. Well, the schools that you went to that gave you basically a Western, European, Eurocentric education, you're going to have to get that out of your brain. And the only way you get that out of your brain is asking questions or interrogating your own historical references. And the more you interrogate Africa itself, as far back as you go all the way back to the Nile Valley civilizations. That's what I would do. And that's what we do at Temple. For example, I'm teaching right now Middle Egyptian. Why am I teaching Middle Egyptian? Because everything in Africa, almost every sense of all knowledge, initiations, libation, all of it begins in the Nile Valley civilizations. If you don't know Kemet and you don't know Nubia and Kush and you don't know Aksum, you have missed all understanding of the diffusion of African knowledge. And so that's why we have to do that. So part of what we have to do, and the world has to do it, that's why we say Pan-World rather than Pan-African here. Pan-World Academy would have to be an academy that's based on the fact that the first thing that we study are the pyramids, not Homer. The first thing that we look at is 25, look, the pyramids were completed 2500 BC. 2,500 years before the Christian era, the pyramids are already completed. There is no Greece in 2500 BC. So there's no reason to study the Greeks. They don't come to 1,000 years or more later. There's nobody. They're the Hindu, In 2200, they're the Chinese in about 2000 or 2200 before the Christian era. But there's only Kemet, Nubia, Aksum. These are the ancient civilizations. So every school in the world, if you're going to create a pan world academy, that pan world academy will say, well, Imhotep, the black man who built the first pyramids, and he must be studied. We have to look at what was his philosophy? What was his harvest song about? Why is it that he was the first human being who was deified? That is, he lived a human life and then he was made a god. They had temples to him 700 years after he lived. Here's where we study physiology, chemistry, because mummification of the people in the burial tombs. This was the basis of human art. To build a pyramid, you need geometry. And why do we have geometry starting in the Nile Valley? Because the flood, the Nile River overflowed its banks every year. And in order to give people the same amount of land that they had before, you had to recreate that. And so the rope stretchers, the people who measured the earth, had to give us geometry, and then we can build the pyramids from there. So there are many, many things that are missed by most people in education. So they don't start, because they don't start at the origin. That's where Afrocentricity is important, because we say, no, you cannot, I'm sorry, I started to use some colloquial American language, but, don't jibe with me. Don't play games with me. Don't tell me that philosophy starts with Socrates. Don't tell me it starts even with Thales, who was the first Greek philosopher, but he went to school in Africa, 600 BC. So don't start me with the Greeks at all. Nothing. No, don't start. You only do that if you're trying to create a Eurocentric idea of a genealogy of thinking that started in Europe and ended in Europe. That is false. Can't do it. So you can go to school. We all went. Most of us who are listening, we all went to these schools. We all got the same education you got in Eritrea. It's the same thing, because that's the Pan-European Academy. It's everywhere. It's in South Africa. It's in Nigeria. It's in Ghana. It's in Kenya. It's in Zambia. It's in Ivory Coast. It's the same one. So what we have to do, though, is accept what we can, and then we've got to interrogate. So I suggest to you just interrogation. You will see that we can use, there's a lot of stuff we can use from the Eurocentric Academy. It's out there. Don't say that it's not. There's nothing good, useful. There is a lot of stuff that's useful, but the African person, particularly the African person, has to learn to know herself and know himself. If you don't know your own history, your own culture, people can tell you anything.
Okay.
I think, do we have another question? I think we'll just.
Yeah, we have other questions.
One last question, please.
Yes, maybe this question is for Dr. Dove, as you were speaking about the key pillars of culture, and language is one of the key pillars. So it's a question from Helen, following from Thespilian's question: could you expand on the concept of African understanding of language and harmonizing?
We have also another question. I don't know if just for the sake of maybe using the time, if we can ask that question and maybe wrap up the session, or we have a question from Terence asking when and how anti-African, anti-blackness and whiteness first came in. Also, if you could talk more about functional purpose of African histories and cultures to eliminate injustice.
Shall I start something then?
Yeah.
In the harmonizing of language, the way it is spoken, the way it is used, I try to show that, that it is the culture that will define the language and the way that it is used. And from an African perspective, it's recognized that the way that you use language, because it is a sound, it must harmonize, it must make beautiful sounds. That's why the early writings, African writings, were all about ways of being and existing and becoming and being human, so that language or rhetoric was something that had to be done in such a way that it was not harmful to people. So writing had to be a reflection of that language, of that speech. So rhetoric was in part of the 7 liberal arts that came out of ancient Africa and has become today's liberal arts. We're in the College of Liberal Arts, and we're taught the liberal arts all separately from each other. So we have a sort of European determination of how these liberal arts should be fashioned. So we don't cross over in these disciplines. But in the original disciplines, the ancient African way, you had to learn about everything because everything is connected. So it was a holistic method of educating people so that they understood the wholeness of the planets, the nature, humanity, the speech, the movement, the thinking, all of that was embodied in these liberal arts, and they were the roots, the educational roots to enlightenment. So, you know, when we're talking about the 7 liberal arts from a Eurocentric perspective today, it's almost in opposition. And it makes sense it would be in opposition, because if you look at the cultural formation, which began with the smallest unit, which was the domination of the woman by the man, which created this patriarchal, hierarchical and racist construct. When you look at that, you see that that stands in direct opposition to male-female reciprocity or female-male reciprocity, which is about harmony, which is about reciprocity, which is about truth, which is about you know, democracy, justice. So, you know, the culture itself is built upon injustice. So it reflects that in everything that is done. So it's all hierarchical. So that's, you know, why it's important to recognize that speech itself and the harmonizing of these sounds can either heal or destroy. That's from an Afrocentric perspective, which is grounded in ancient Africa. Hopefully I've answered that. I know there were other things, but I can't remember them. But I think there was a dating about when race, the construction of race came into being.
Yes, how anti-African and anti-blackness came into you can probably, you've been writing and working on that, so that may be a good question for you too, Dr. Dove.
Well, I'm dating it, as I showed on the PowerPoint, to when we could see it written, when it was codified. And I'm sure it happened before then, because, you know, the codification of things is usually you're now constructing, you're writing, you're making legal, or you're making some kind of document about this thing that's happening, but you're usually doing it before it happens. That's the usual way. So if you look at the Hebraic idea of
Shem, Ham, and Japhet.
Yes, the how, you know, Ham is punished because he, from the 6th century Talmud rendition of it, and it goes back, of course, but that's where we have the evidence that the black person was punished for castrating the father, Noah, and his sons were the producers of the world's people. So that's, and then we come to the Indo-Aryan Brahmanism, where you have the 5 colors here, and these people actually, these Indo-Aryans conquered the African people in India and created a hierarchy where the people who were literate before they came and they learned from became at the bottom of this hierarchy, the Sudra people, and then beneath them came the Dalits, who are also black, but they're the relationships between the four different races, which they call
Caste.
Caste. Yeah. So these are evidence of this behavior and thinking and belief, about this melanin thing. They may all have different names. Even class has a different name, but class is still based on race. Not only that, the energies and the profits made from black people furnish class in a certain way, but any black person in any of these supposed classes, which, class is considered to be the major global oppression by some, which it certainly isn't, because it doesn't take into account race. But it is race that was used. It was the black-skinned people that were used to create the profit that created the class of workers and people inside this industrial thing. It couldn't have happened without black people, so where's the race? And then the women inside that, what happened to them? The women inside the Indo-Aryan thing are just like the Dalits, and they can be raped at any minute, killed at any minute. It doesn't matter. The life of the Dalits is worthless. These are the structures that are in place, and we have to look at them to see that there are cultural similarities among people who do that, who believe in these unjust hierarchies. There are similarities among these people, and all of them are patriarchal, interestingly enough. But I can't give you the exact dates, only to say, I think Dr. Asante mentioned, was it 2200? I couldn't remember what you said, yeah. 1800 or something like that for sure. The Indo-Aryans and
Sure, that's right. And I just want to add one thing, because I see another question, which I'll just do this real quickly, and that is, the European formation of this sort of arises with the adventurers and ultimately with the enslavement of African people. So from the, I think, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, then you get the development of what we call the racial ladder. And that is where many people, and I guess Darwin has to be put in there, but certainly Buffon, Linnaeus, some of the other Europeans who tried to say how many races there were and to describe what each race, the characteristics of each race. And every time, of course, any description happens, by virtue of this, then what happens, you see that the darker people, the black people, are at the bottom, and then they've given ascriptions. And this is why Tommy Curry, who's now teaching at Edinburgh, is so important, because his book, The Man Not, is an extremely provocative and brilliant book, because he tries to break down these stereotypes. Because what happens is the racial ladder is precisely why the young black man from Sierra Leone in Scotland, Sheku, was killed, was because 9 policemen surround this brother who somebody said had a knife, but he didn't have a knife when they caught up with him, but they said he was acting erratic, and so 9 policemen basically beat him to death. Now, they would never have done that to a white person, to a Scottish person. It is almost never unheard of. A white Scottish guy walking down the street being beat up by 9 police. But the problem is Black lives do not matter, because in the minds of these white police in Scotland, in a place where there's only 1% Black people, only 1% of the population is Black, they have this thing, this racial ladder in their mind, that Black lives do not matter as much as white lives. And they have that because that's what they were taught. They were taught that Black people are lazy, Black people are, and sometimes they have contradictory things. Black people are lazy, but they're real aggressive. They will do this or that, and really, and and then of course at the top of the ladder is always white males. That's the thing. White males at the top, and that's the patriarchy that we talk about. You see. Anyway, there's much more to say, but we have said probably enough. Okay, but thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we are almost 10 minutes past our scheduled time now. We will end here. Thank you so much for the inspirational and thought-provoking presentations and discussions, Professor Asante and Dr. Dove. And thank you for the reflections, Professor Allison. Also, thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope we've got something to take away from the seminars and learn it, at least to ask questions different questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was really an inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.